Chapter 12 of Superwomen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune. Chapter 12. Lady Hamilton, patron saint of dime novel heroines. She was the mother of Gertrude, the governess, the grande dame of Bertha, the beautiful sewing-machine girl, the earliest ancestrette of Ione, the pride of the mill. She was the impossibility that made possible the brain daughters of Laura Jean. She was the patron saint of all the dime novel heroines. She was the model, consciously or otherwise, probably otherwise, of all their authors. Because at a period when such things were undreamed of, even in fiction, she rose from nursemaid to title. Even in the books and plays of that age, the born serving wench did not marry the heir. In the highest literary flights, Bridget's crowning reward was to wed Luke, the gamekeeper, and become landlady of the Bibulous Goat or the Doodlethorpe Arms. Goldsmith was eyed askance for even making the heroine of She Stoops to Conquer pose momentarily as a lady's maid. Having thus tried to show how impossible was the happening, let me work up by degrees to the happening itself. She was a Lancashire lass, Emma Lyon by name. In mature years she dropped the Lyon and called herself Emma Hart. No one knows why. Lyon was not her name, neither was Hart for that matter. In fact, she had no name, her careless parents having failed to supply her with the legal right to one. Her father was a rural farmhand. He died while Emma was a baby. Her mother, an inn servant, moved later to Hawarden, and there a Mrs. Thomas hired Emma as nursemaid. This was in 1777. Emma was 13. She had already learned to read, a rare accomplishment in those days for the nameless brat of an inn drudge, and as nursemaid she greedily picked up stray morsels of her little charge's education, as well as the manners and language of her employers. She learned as quickly as a Chinaman. There is a hiatus in the records after Emma had served a year or so in the Thomas family. One biographer bridges the gap with a line of asterisks. Asterisks in biographies, as well as in sex problem fiction, may indicate either a lapse of time or a lapse of morals. Emma reappeared from the asterisk cloud in London, where she was nursemaid in the house of a Dr. Budd, one of the physicians at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Dr. Budd's housemaid at that time, by the way, later became a Drury Lane star under the name of Mrs. Powell. And in that bright after-day, she and the even more apotheosized Emma renewed their below-stairs friendship. For some reason, Emma left Dr. Budd's service rather suddenly and found a job as helper in the shop of a St. James Market mercer. She was 16, and she was gloriously beautiful. Her figure was superb. Already she had a subtle charm of her own, which drew to her feet crowds of footmen, shop-boys, apprentices, and such small deer. There is no record that they one and all were sent away disconsolate. During her brief career as helper to the St. James Market mercer, Emma chanced to attract the notice of a woman of quality who one day entered the shop, and forthwith she was hired as lady's maid. The girl had picked up a smattering of education. She had scraped from her pink tongue the rough Lancashire burr. She had learned to speak correctly, to ape the behavior of the solid folk whose servant she had been. Now, from her new employer, she was to learn at first hand how people in the world of fashion comported themselves, and, chameleon-like, she took on the color of her gay surroundings. Soon she could lisp such choice and fashionable expletives as "scrape me raw" and "Oh, lay me bleedin'," and could talk and walk and posture as did her mistress. Trashy novels by the dozen fell into her hands from her mistress's table. Emma devoured them gluttonously and absorbed their precepts as the human system absorbs alcohol fumes. Please don't for one moment get the idea that there was anything profitable to a young girl in the novels of the latter 18th century. Perhaps you have in mind such dreary, sterling works as Pamela, Clarissa Harlowe, Sir Charles Grandison, and others that were crammed into your miserably protesting brain in the literature courses. Those were the very rare exceptions to a large and lurid list which included such choice classics as Moll Flanders, Roxana, both of them by the same Defoe who wrote Robinson Crusoe, and whose other novels would send a present-day publisher to state's prison, Peregrine Pickle, Fanny Hill, The Delicate Distress, Roderick Random, and the rest of a rank-flavored multitude. Emma reveled in the joys of the local circulating library, too, one of those places that loaned books of a sort to cause even the kindly Sheridan to thunder his famous dictum, "A circulating library in a town is an evergreen tree of diabolical knowledge. It blossoms through the year, and, depend on't, they who are so fond of handling the leaves will long for the fruit at last." Much reading filled Emma with wonderful new ideas of life. Incidentally, it made her neglect her work, and she was discharged. Her next step was to become barmaid in a tavern. While she was there, a young admirer of hers was seized by the Navy press gang. Emma went to the captain of the ship to beg for her swain's release. The captain was John Willett Payne, afterward a rear admiral. Payne granted the lovely girl's plea. He not only gave her what she asked, but his own admiration as well. Her story as a heart-winner had begun. In fiction, the gallant captain would soon have tired of his lively sweetheart and cast her aside. But Emma was not a lowly sweetheart. She was a superwoman. She showed how much stranger than fiction truth may be by deserting Payne for a richer man. First, however, she had wheedled the captain into hiring tutors and music masters for her, and she profited vastly by their teachings. Her new flame was a sporting baronet, Sir Harry Featherstonehaugh, of Up Park, Sussex. Sir Harry was an all-around athlete and a reckless horseman. He taught Emma to ride, a beggar on horseback, and she became the most daring equestrienne of the century. He taught her to spend money, too, and so splendidly did she learn her lesson that inside of a year Sir Harry was bankrupt. Perhaps all rats do not leave a sinking ship, but for very good reasons one never hears anything further of the rats that don't. The rat that wishes to continue his career wastes no time in joining the exodus. And Emma Lyon did not disdain to take example from the humble rodent. There seemed no good reason for remaining longer at the side of the bankrupt baronet, to add to his cares and expenses, so, with womanly consideration, she left him. She was alone in the world once more, without a shilling or a friend, equipped with education, accomplishments, wondrous beauty and charm, but with no immediate market for those commodities. It was the black hour that comes least once into the life of every adventuress. And in this time of need she fell in with a beauty-culture quack, Graham by name. Graham had devised a rejuvenation medicine. From Dr. Faustus down, the world has feverishly, piteously seized on every nostrum advertised as a means of exchanging age for youth, and he vowed that it would make its users not only young again, but maddeningly beautiful. As an example of after-using, Graham exhibited Emma Lyon, who, he said, had once been old and ugly, and who, by a course of his elixir, had become youthful and glorious. He called his medicine megalanthropogenesis. Women who heard his lecture took one look at Emma and then bought out Graham's ready supply of the stuff. The charlatan was an artist in gaining his effects, as witness a report of the exhibition in which Emma posed. He had contrived a bed of Apollo, or celestial bed, on which, in a delicately colored light, this exquisitely beautiful woman, nearly naked, was gradually unveiled, to soft, soft music, as Hygeia, goddess of health. Presumably no effort was made by any 18th-century Comstock to suppress this show, and all London flocked and thronged and jostled to behold it. Apart from the normal crowd of idlers, came painters and sculptors to gaze in delight on the perfect face and form revealed through the shimmer of rose-colored light. And foremost of these artists was a freakish genius toward whom was slowly creeping the insanity that a few years later was to claim him, and whose stealthy approach he was even then watching with horror. He was George Romney, who, with Sir Joshua Reynolds, divided the homage of England's art world. Romney had come to stare at Emma. He remained to worship. He engaged her as his model, and soon or late painted no less than 39 pictures of her. "I call her the Divine Lady," he once wrote, "for I think she is superior to all womankind." The black hour was past. Emma Lyon's fortune and fame were secure. Thanks to Romney, she was the best advertised beauty on earth. Conquests came thick and fast, not treading on one another's heels, but racing abreast. Soon, out of the ruck and forging far ahead, appeared Charles Francis Greville, wit, art connoisseur, and nephew and heir of the famed antiquary diplomat Sir William Hamilton. Greville cut out all rivals, Romney among the rest, and won Emma for his own. Theirs was an odd love affair, for here, too, Emma gave full rein to her craving for education, and she showed for the first time just why she was so eager to be highly educated. It was not for mere learning's sake, but to enhance the charm that gave her a hold over men. She cared nothing for any but the showy accomplishments. She already had a fair groundwork in English and ordinary school studies. She made Greville get her the best teachers in singing, in dancing, in acting. Perhaps she looked forward to a stage triumph, but more likely to outshining the colorless bread-and-butter women of her day. Never did pupil better repay the pains of her teachers. Her voice presently rivaled that of many a prima donna. Her dancing was a delight. It was she who conceived the celebrated shawl dance that was the rage throughout Europe for years thereafter, and that still is used in very slightly modified form by première danseuses. But acting was Emma's forte. Says a contemporary writer, "With a common piece of stuff, she could so arrange and clothe herself as to offer the most appropriate representations of a Jewess, a Roman matron, a Helen, Penelope, or Aspasia. No character seemed foreign to her, and the grace she was in the habit of displaying under such representations excited the admiration of all who were fortunate enough to be present on such occasions. Siddons could not surpass the grandeur of her style, or O'Neill be more melting in the utterance of deep pathos." In this heyday of her prosperity, Emma hunted up her aged and disreputable mother, bestowed on her the name Mrs. Cadogan, and settled a rich pension on her. At about the same time, too, Emma bade a cheery farewell to the serviceable name of Lyon, and took to calling herself Emma Hart. Then Greville went broke. In his new-found poverty, he hit on a plan of life foreign to all his old ideas. He decided to ask his rich old uncle, Sir William Hamilton, to pay his debts and settle a little annuity on him. With his sum as a means of livelihood, he intended to marry Emma, and, with her and their 3 children, settle down in some cheap suburb. How this appealed to Emma, history forgets to say. Judging by both past and future, it is not unjust to suppose that she may have been making ready once more to emulate the ship-deserting rat. But this time she did not need to. The ship was about to desert her, for a consideration. Greville, full of his new hopes, went to Sir William Hamilton and laid the plan before him. His nephew's derelictions from the straight and narrow path had long distressed the virtuous old diplomat, and in Greville's financial troubles, Sir William thought he saw a fine chance to break off his nephew's discreditable affair with Emma. He offered to set Greville on his feet again if that luckless youth would drop Emma's acquaintance. The enamored Greville refused. Sir William insisted, raising his offer of financial aid and pointing out, with tearful eloquence, the family disgrace that a marriage to a woman of Emma's dissolute character must cause. It was all quite like a scene from a modern problem play. But fate, her tongue in her cheek, was preparing to put a twist on the end of the scene worthy of the most cynical French vaudeville writer. Greville resented his uncle's rash judgment of his adored Emma, and begged him to come and see her for himself, hoping that Emma's wonder charm might soften the old man's virtue-encrusted heart. Reluctantly, Sir William consented to one brief interview with the wicked siren. At sight of Emma, Sir William's heart melted to mushiness. He fell crazily in love with the woman he had come to dispossess. There was another long and stormy scene between uncle and nephew, after which Greville, for an enormous lump sum, transferred to Sir William Hamilton all right and title and goodwill to the adorable Emma Hart. And Sir William and Emma departed thence, arm in arm, leaving Greville a sadder but a richer man. What became of the 3 children I don't know. By the way, Emma had taught them to call her aunt, not mother. Will you let me quote a deadly dry line or two from an encyclopedia to prove to you how important a personage Sir William was, and how true is the axiom about no fool like an old fool? Hamilton, Sir William, British diplomatist and antiquary, 1730 to 1803, student of art, philosophy, and literature. From 1764 to 1800, English ambassador to the court of Naples, trustee of British Museum, fellow of the Royal Society, vice president of the Society of Antiquaries, distinguished member of the Dilettante Club, author of several books. Sir Joshua Reynolds, his intimate friend, painted his portrait, which hangs in the National Gallery. Sir William, who was home on leave of absence when he met Emma, took her back with him to Italy. But before they sailed, she had prevailed on him to marry her. It was easy. He was old. The marriage was kept secret until, in 1791, she led her husband back to England on another leave of absence, and up to the altar of St. George's Church, where, on September 6 of that year, they were married all over again, this time with every atom of publicity Emma could compass. She was then 27. Her husband was 61. In state, they returned to the court of Naples, the most corrupt, licentious, false, utterly abominable court in all Europe. If you will glance at the annals of the courts of that period, you will find this statement is as true as it is sweeping. On her earlier visit, As the supposed brevet bride of the ambassador, Emma had been warmly received by Marie Caroline, Queen of Naples and sister to Marie Antoinette of France. Emma and Marie Caroline were kindred spirits, which is perhaps the unkindest thing I could say about either of them, and they quickly formed a lasting friendship for each other. Emma was glad to get back to Naples. Apart from her marriage, her visit to England had not been a success. A certain element in London society, attracted by her beauty, her voice, and her talent as an actress, had taken her up, but Queen Charlotte had refused her a presentation at the British court, and the more reputable element of the nobility had followed royal example and given her a wide berth. English society under George III was severely respectable, at least in the matter of externals, a quality it was soon to mislay under George IV. Hence Emma's joy at returning to a court where respectability was a term to be found only in the dictionary. The King of Naples was a fool. His wife was the little kingdom's ruler. Emma, Lady Hamilton, became her chief adviser. Writes one historian, "It is not too much to say of these two women that for years they wielded the destinies of Naples, and seriously affected the character of the wars that ended with the peace of Europe in 1815, when both were dead. Both were endowed with powers of mind far above the average of their sex. Both exhibited energy and understanding that inspired them to bold and decisive, if not always laudable, deeds. Both were as remarkable for their personal beauty as for their self-reliance, their knowledge of men, and their determination to make the most of their information." To say that Marie Caroline loved Lady Hamilton is to misstate a fact. There was no love in the royal composition, but her ungovernable and undying hatred of the French inclined her, no doubt, in the first instance toward the wife of the English ambassador, and the subsequent devotion of the favorite secured an attachment that is confessed and reiterated through whole pages of a vehement and overstrained correspondence. Naples just then was between two fires. There was fear of a French invasion, which arrived on schedule time, and there was also danger that England would ruin Neapolitan commerce. Emma's white hands were at once plunged wrist-deep into the political dough, and a sorry mess she proceeded to make of it. For example, the King of Spain wrote a confidential letter to his brother, the King of Naples, accusing the English government of all sorts of public and private crimes, and telling of Spain's secret alliance with France. The king showed it to his wife, who in turn showed it to Lady Hamilton. Emma stole and secretly sent the letter to the British cabinet. The result was a bloody war between England and Spain. About 2 years after Emma's marriage, an English warship, the Agamemnon, touched at Naples, and her captain called to pay his respects to the British ambassador and to deliver a letter from the admiral of the Mediterranean fleet. After a few minutes' talk with the captain, Sir William insisted that the latter should meet Lady Hamilton. He bustled into the drawing-room to prepare Emma for the visitor's arrival, saying excitedly to her, "I am bringing you a little man who cannot boast of being very handsome, but who, I pronounce, will one day astonish the world. I know it from the very words of conversation I have had with him." On the heels of Sir William's announcement, the little man came into the room. At first glance, he scarcely seemed to justify Hamilton's enthusiasm. He was clad in a full-laced uniform. His lank, unpowdered hair was tied in a stiff Hessian queue of extraordinary length. Old-fashioned, flaring waistcoat flaps added to the general oddity of his figure. Sir William introduced him as Captain Horatio Nelson. Lady Hamilton lavished on the queer guest no especial cordiality. It is not known that she gave him a second thought. Nelson, little more impressed by the Superwoman, wrote to his wife in England an account of the call, saying of Lady Hamilton, whose story of course he and everybody knew, "She is a young woman of amiable manners, who does honor to the station to which she has been raised." Yet Nelson had unwittingly met the woman who was to tarnish the pure glory of his fame. And Emma had met the man but for whom she would today be forgotten. So little does fate forecast her dramas that, at the first meeting, neither of the two immortal lovers seems to have felt any attraction for the other. Not for 5 busy years did Nelson and Emma Hamilton see each other again. Then Nelson came back to Naples, this time in triumph, a world-renowned hero, the champion of the seas, Britain's idol. He had become an admiral, a peer of England, a scourge of his country's foes. Back to Naples he came. Part of him, not all, for victorious warfare had set cruel marks on him. He had left his right eye at Calvi in 1794, and his right arm at Teneriffe in 1797. He was more odd-looking than ever, but he was an acclaimed hero, and Naples in general, and Emma Hamilton in particular, welcomed him with rapture. He was in search of the French fleet, and he wanted the King of Naples to let him re-provision his ships in the Neapolitan harbor. Now, France and Naples just then happened to be at peace, and by their treaty, no more than 2 English warships at a time could enter any Neapolitan or Sicilian port. The King's Council declared the treaty must stand. Lady Hamilton decided otherwise. She used all her power with the Queen to have the treaty set aside. As a result, Marie Caroline issued an order directing all governors of the 2 Sicilies to water, victual, and aid Nelson's fleet. This order made it possible for Nelson to go forth re-provisioned and to crush the French in the Battle of the Nile. In the first rumor of this battle that reached Naples, Nelson was reported killed. Soon afterward he appeared alive and well in the harbor. Here is his letter to his wife telling how Lady Hamilton received him on his return. Nelson, by the way, had been married for nearly 12 years. He and his wife were devoted to each other. Judging from this letter, he was lamentably ignorant of women, or was incredibly sure of Lady Nelson's love and trust, or else his courage was greater than that of mortal husband. He wrote, "Sir William and Lady Hamilton came out to sea to meet me. They, my most respectable friends, had nearly been laid up and seriously ill, first from anxiety and then from joy. It was imprudently told Lady Hamilton in a moment that I was alive, and the effect was like a shot. She fell apparently dead, and is not yet perfectly recovered from severe bruises. Alongside came my honored friends. The scene in the boat was terribly affecting. Up flew her ladyship, and exclaiming, 'Oh, God, is it possible?' she fell into my arms more dead than alive. Tears, however, soon set matters to rights, when alongside came the king. I hope some day to have the pleasure of introducing you to Lady Hamilton. She is one of the very best women in the world. She is an honor to her sex. Her kindness, with Sir William's, to me is more than I can express. I am in their house, and I may tell you it required all the kindness of my friends to set me up. Lady Hamilton intends writing to you. May God Almighty bless you, and give us in due time a happy meeting." France sought revenge for the help given to Nelson's fleet, and declared war on Naples. The Neapolitans, in fury at being dragged into such a needless conflict, rose against their dear king and adored queen, especially against their adored queen, and threatened to kill them. By Lady Hamilton's aid, the royal family reached Nelson's flagship and took refuge there from the mob. Sir William and Lady Hamilton went along. The populace looted the British embassy and stole everything of value Sir William owned, about $195,000 worth of property in all. Thus, Hamilton was the third man who had lost a fortune through Emma. Meanwhile, Nelson had sailed to Palermo, taking the fugitives along. There he made his home with the Hamiltons, and scandal awoke even in that easygoing crowd. Nor did the scandal die down to any appreciable extent on the birth of Lady Hamilton's daughter Horatia a year or so later. Sir William's conduct in the matter is still a puzzle. He felt, or professed to feel, that there was no occasion for jealousy, and so for a long time the trio shared the same house. One of the courtiers who had fled with the king and queen to Palermo was Prince Caraccioli, Nelson's close friend and Lady Hamilton's bitter enemy. Caraccioli asked leave to go back to Naples to look after his endangered property. As soon as he reached the city, he threw in his lot with the rebels and was made admiral of their navy. Presently, by the aid of England's fleet, the royal family returned. The rebellion was put down, and the king and queen were once more seated firmly on their thrones. The rebel leaders were seized and brought to trial. Nelson is said to have promised immunity to Caraccioli if he would surrender. Relying on his friend's pledge, Caraccioli surrendered. At Emma's request, Nelson had the over-trustful man hanged from the yardarm of his own flagship. This is the darkest smear on Nelson's character, a smear that even his most blatant admirers have never been able to wipe away. It is not in keeping with anything else in his life, but by this time he belonged to Lady Hamilton, body and soul. She, by the way, had managed to acquire from her friend, the Queen of Naples, a nice tendency toward bloodthirstiness, as witness the following sweet anecdote by Prynne Lockhart Gordon, who tells of dining with the Hamiltons at Palermo in company with a Turkish officer. In the course of conversation, the officer boasted that with the sword he wore he had put to death a number of French prisoners. "Look," he said, "there is their blood remaining on it." When the speech was translated to her, Lady Hamilton's eyes beamed with delight. "Oh, let me see the sword that did the glorious deed," she exclaimed. Taking the sword in her hands, which were covered with jewels, she looked at it, then kissed the encrusted blood on the blade, and passed it on to Nelson. Only one who was a witness to the spectacle can imagine how disgusting it was. Enshrined once more at Naples, hailed as savior of the realm, acclaimed for her share in the Nile victory, the confidante of royalty, it would be pleasant to say good-bye here to Emma Lyon, ex-nursemaid, ex-barmaid, ex-lady's maid, nameless offspring of a Lancashire inn slavey. It was the climax of a wonderful life, but there was anticlimax aplenty to follow. Nelson went home to England to receive the plaudits of his fellow countrymen and to settle accounts with his wife. Home, too, came the Hamiltons, Sir William having been recalled. Lady Nelson was not at the dock to meet her hero husband. Bad news travelled fast, even before we boosted it along by wire and then by wireless. Lady Nelson had heard, and Lady Nelson was waiting at home. Thither, blithely enough, fared the man in whose praise a million Englishmen were cheering themselves hoarse, and in whose silver-buckled shoes perhaps no married Englishman would just then have cared or dared to stand. But Nelson was a hero. He went home. I once had a collie puppy that had never chanced to be at close quarters with a cat. I was privileged to see him when he made his first gleefully fearless attack upon one, ignorant of the potential anguish tucked away behind a feline's velvety paws. Somehow, with no disrespect to a great man, I always think of that poor, about-to-be disillusioned puppy when I try to visualize the picture of Nelson's homecoming. Just what happened, no one knows. But whatever it was, it did not teach Nelson the wisdom of husbandly reticence. For a few weeks later he remarked at breakfast, "I have just received another letter from dear Lady Hamilton." "I am sick of hearing of dear Lady Hamilton," flared the long-suffering wife. "You can choose between us. You must give up her or me." "Take care, Fanny," warned Nelson. "I love you dearly, but I cannot forget all I owe to dear Lady Hamilton." "This is the end, then," announced Lady Nelson, and she left the house. Only once again did she and her husband meet. Nelson cast off all pretense at concealment after his wife left him. His affair with Lady Hamilton became public property. Their daughter, Horatia, was openly acclaimed by him as his heiress. The English were in a quandary. They loved Nelson. They hated the woman who had dragged his name into the filth. They could not snub her without making him unhappy. They could not honor him without causing her to shine by reflected glory. It was unpleasant all around. In 1805, the deadlock was broken. Nelson was again to fight the French. He told Lady Hamilton and many others that this campaign was to end in his death. He ordered his coffin made ready for him. Then he sailed against the French fleet, met it off Cape Trafalgar, and annihilated it. In the thick of the fight, a musket ball gave him his death wound. He was carried below, and there, the battle raging around him, he laboriously wrote a codicil to his will, entreating his king and country to repay his services by settling a pension on Lady Hamilton. Then, to his next in command, he panted, "I am going fast. Come nearer. Pray let my dear Lady Hamilton have my hair and all other things belonging to me. Take care of my dear Lady Hamilton. Poor Lady Hamilton. Thank God I have done my duty." And so he died, this knightly little demigod, true lover, false husband, who had fouled his snowy escutcheon for a worthless woman. Now comes the inevitable anticlimax. All England turned with loathing from Lady Hamilton. Her husband was dead. Lovers stood aloof. Folk who had received her for Nelson's sake barred their doors against her. She had followed the popular custom of living in luxury on nothing a year. Now her creditors swarmed upon her. Her house was sold for debt. Next, she lived in Bond Street lodgings, growing poorer day by day until she was condemned to the debtor's prison. A kind-hearted, or hopeful, alderman bought her out of jail. A former coachman of hers, whose wages were still unpaid, threatened her with arrest for debt. She fled to Calais. There she lived in an attic, saved from absolute starvation by a fellow Englishwoman, a Mrs. Hunter. Her youth and charm had fled. The power that had lured Nelson and Greville and Hamilton to ruin was gone. In 1815 she died. She was buried in a pine box with an old black silk petticoat for a pall. No clergyman could be found to take charge of her funeral. So the burial service was read by a fellow debt exile, a half-pay Irish army captain. One wonders, perhaps morbidly, if Nelson's possible punishment in another world might not have been the knowledge of what befell his dear Lady Hamilton in her latter days. End of chapter 12. Recording by Linda Johnson. End of Superwomen by Albert Payson Terhune.